I played in a band at night time. I'd already been quite successful with a little band called Geordie. We'd had 2 or 3 minor hits.
For years, there have been rumors about AC/DC's hit song. This time, Brian Johnson, the legendary frontman, has finally broken his silence, putting to rest decades of speculation about who wrote the lyrics and why Bon Scott's family still gets royalties. Join us as we unveil all the details. It's been over 40 years since the release of one of the biggest rock records of all time, AC/DC's Back in Black. All through this period, English singer Brian Johnson and the entire AC/DC band have been faced with lots of debates and rumors, more like a conspiracy theory over who wrote the AC/DC's 1980s hit song. It was speculated that the late Bon Scott, who fronted the Aussie band before his passing in February 1980, was the one who wrote down most of the words to the album in one of his notebooks before he passed on. However, Brian Johnson, who eventually took over as frontman after Scott's passing, was able to address this whole long-time rumor. Brian Francis Johnson DeLuca was born on the 5th of October, 1947. He was able to blossom in his career as an English singer and songwriter. During the period of 1980, following the passing of Bon Scott, he became the 3rd lead singer of the Australian rock band AC/DC. Johnson was one of the founding members of the rock band Geordie, which was formed in Newcastle in 1971. Following their many hit singles, including the UK Top 10 hit All Because of You, which was released in 1973, the band split in 1978. Following the passing of Bon Scott, Johnson was then asked to audition as a frontman for AC/DC. Before this time, guitarists and founders Angus and Malcolm Young remembered when Scott was once impressed with Johnson's talents as Geordie's frontman, so they thought of bringing him in. As a band, AC/DC was first formed in 1973 in Sydney by the Young brothers, who, alongside drummer Phil Rudd and bassist Mark Evans, released their debut album, High Voltage. During the time Johnson was with the band, his very first album with AC/DC, Back in Black, became the 2nd best-selling album of all time. In fact, the successful transition of the band from Scott to Johnson as frontman was ranked by The Guardian at number 36 on their list of 50 key events in rock music history. By the break of 2003, Johnson and the rest of the band were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Fast forward to March 2016, Johnson temporarily left the band during the Rock or Bust World Tour due to hearing issues which he developed. By September 2020, the band AC/DC confirmed that Brian Johnson and the other bandmates Phil Rudd and Cliff Williams had rejoined the group in August 2018 to record the album Power Up. Brian Johnson is famously recognized for his distinctive vocals and strong Geordie accent. Sometime in July 2014, he was awarded an honorary degree of Doctor of Music by Northumbria University in Newcastle in recognition of his significant contribution to the music industry. As a young child, regardless of his age at that time, Johnson performed in various shows with the Scouts and also appeared in a play that aired on television. Aside from that, he went on to join a local church choir. By the time he decided to launch into his music career fully, his first band was the Gobi Desert Canoe Club. During the period, Johnson played with a club band, the Jasper Hart Band, and together with other members of the band, they were able to form Geordie. As a member of Geordie, Johnson released his first and only solo single, I Can't Forget You Now, in January 1976. By the break of 1982, a compilation, including 10 of Geordie's songs, was issued as Brian Johnson's solo album, Strange Man, on the MCA label. Following Bon Scott's passing, the remaining members of AC/DC at a point thought about quitting, before concluding that Scott would have wanted AC/DC to continue. Before Brian Johnson was eventually picked, various candidates were considered as a replacement for Scott, including some famous artists like Terry Slessor and Noddy Holder, who declined. Following their decision, Brian Johnson was selected. According to Angus, he mentioned that the very first time he had ever heard Brian Johnson's name was from Scott. This was when Scott was on a tour with them, and he mentioned that Brian Johnson was a great rock and roll singer in the style of Little Richard. Fortunately, Little Richard at that time was Bon Scott's idol. Angus went further to mention that when Scott saw Johnson at that time, to him, it was more like Johnson was a guy that knew what rock and roll was all about. Angus also stated that Scott mentioned Johnson to them while in Australia, so somehow when they decided to continue, Brian was the first name that Malcolm and himself came up with, so they decided to go search for him. The band agreed immediately that Johnson's performing style fit AC/DC's music. By the break of March 1980, Johnson received a phone call inviting him to London to audition as the new vocalist for AC/DC. As a big AC/DC fan, he was happy about the news. By the time the day for the audition came, someone took him in to meet them, and Malcolm recalls that Johnson had tears in his eyes. He was as sad about Bon Scott as the band members were. After the audition with Johnson, the members were quite glad that Johnson could fit in perfectly. So, that was how Johnson joined the iconic band AC/DC. A few days after he joined the band, the news was being made official. A week after that, he was sent a plane ticket to the Bahamas, where he had to join the band. The beginning of their collaboration was the album Back in Black. The album soon became a worldwide success and went on to become the second best-selling album of all time. By the break of 1986, Johnson returned to Tyneside and appeared in the music video for You Shook Me All Night Long, which was also a success. Starting with The Razor's Edge, released in 1990, guitarists Angus and Malcolm Young have written all of AC/DC's material. When asked by a fan during a radio interview why he stopped contributing lyrics, Johnson jokingly said that he ran out of words and that somehow he did not always enjoy the pressure of having to come up with an album's worth of lyrics. So he was relieved when the other band members took on all of those responsibilities. The 1988 album Blow Up Your Video was the last AC/DC album to feature lyrics from Johnson. Well, as the years went by, unlike other bands where a key band member's departure is always tied to either conflict in the band or the tragic passing of the member, Johnson, his departure did not fall into either category. While on tour in 2016, Johnson found out he couldn't hear with his ear properly. The doctors informed him that unless he stopped performing immediately, his hearing problems could worsen, and he might probably go deaf. As such, Johnson had to leave the band. Now, the natural assumption would be that Johnson's hearing loss came from a career spent banging around at rock concerts. That's not entirely it though, as Johnson later explained his health issues during an interview. He mentioned that he got it from sitting in a race car too long without earplugs. It got so bad that he could hear his eardrum burst. Following the news of Johnson's health challenge, Stephen Ambrose, an in-ear technology specialist, reached out to him with his synthetic eardrum that absorbs harmful pressures. By the 90s, Ambrose had already introduced the technology to Guns N' Roses and thought Johnson might be interested. Johnson was glad to find out that with Ambrose's work, he could hear music again. By the break of August 2018, rumors started circulating that Brian Johnson was seen near the recording studio where AC/DC was working on their next album. Then, in 2019, another speculation about Johnson agreeing to be on the new AC/DC album came forward, claiming that he would both appear on AC/DC's next album and their tour. Following the news of Johnson's departure, more rumors came forth suggesting that the band probably fired Johnson in a bid to replace him with Guns N' Roses singer Axl Rose. Well, as the controversy got popular, Angus had to address the rumor by stating clearly that Brian was not fired. Rather, he had to leave because of his hearing issue, stating that he already had a very bad ear, and the good ear he had left was dropping rapidly. It was out of our hands. It was his call to either stop performing or not. As time went on, Axl Rose himself mentioned in an interview that he wanted to do justice to Johnson's work with the band, but he meant no disrespect to the singer who is unable to tour due to hearing issues. He went further to mention that he is happy and excited in one sense, but he thinks it would be inappropriate to celebrate in a certain way at someone else's expense. So, somehow, the controversy about Johnson's replacement and the rumors were all true, but due to the bittersweet ends of the incident, the band probably didn't see it as something to be celebrated. According to Rose, he wasn't looking at it like he was singing for AC/DC. Rather, he saw it like he was just trying to also help out. It's been decades since the release of one of the biggest rock records of all time, AC/DC's Back in Black. Through these years, English singer Brian Johnson has been haunted by a conspiracy theory over who put pen to paper on the 1980s AC/DC's hit song. Let's get to the details. There have been persistent rumors that the late Bon Scott, who was the frontman of AC/DC, had written most of the lyrics of the album in one of his notebooks before he passed on. However, Johnson, who took over as frontman, has finally decided to address this controversy. While it is said that the song came about from Scott telling a story to his bandmates about his landlord's complaints about the volume of his music, AC/DC co-founder and guitarist Angus Young has previously said that even if Scott did talk to them about the incident with his landlord, they didn't end up using any of his lyrics. According to him, they decided not to use any of the lyrics from Scott's story to avoid looking like they were profiting from his untimely passing. According to Johnson, he mentioned that he knew there was an individual who was a conspiracy theorist and who just kept saying that Scott wrote those lyrics. He went further questioning what band would let somebody else claim somebody else's lyrics. To him, it was just absolute nonsense. Going further, he decided to state that once and for all, those lyrics came from the end of his hand with a pen in it, mentioning that there are people out there that just won't believe what's true. As a result of the controversies that came up, Johnson said that he felt awful after putting it down in the book, but somehow it had just been on his nerves for so long. That wasn't all. He went further to state how much he still loves listening to Bon Scott's fantastic lyrics, his double interpretations, his funny little remarks, and how he couldn't do that. As a band, Angus and the late Malcolm Young, alongside Brian Johnson, are credited as the writers of all songs on AC/DC's 7th studio album, Back in Black. The legendary album was released just 5 months after the passing of Scott and 3 months after Johnson officially joined the band, which didn't help in clearing the air about who actually wrote the lyrics considering the period, and when the album was released, it only made the conspiracy theory worse. It was a complete work of musical art, going on to become one of the best-selling albums in history, and was recorded over just 7 weeks in the Bahamas from April to May 1980. In a series of interviews, Brian Johnson has been able to shoot down theories that Bon Scott wrote some of the words for the Back in Black album. When he was asked in an interview, he mentioned that when he first heard the theory that Bon's lyrics were used, it was more like a shock to him considering the time this took place, which was around 1980 and 1985. During this time, there was no social media, and then there was this guy in Australia who was positive that Bon had written the lyrics. It got so serious that somehow the guy wouldn't shut up and he wouldn't go away, plus he was so bent on it to the point of phoning Derek, Bon's brother, who at some point even got tired of how persistent the guy was becoming. The controversy was centered on the fact that he claimed that Bon was the one who originally wrote the lyrics, and that Johnson had claimed them. According to Johnson, in the real world, that just doesn't happen. First of all, Johnson mentioned that the boys in the band would have given them to him to sing, and they would have put Scott's name if Scott wrote the lyrics. It's that simple. That wasn't all. The guy pushing the controversy also went as far as suggesting that he wanted to make a movie of Bon's life. And of course, the family refused. Although Johnson commented that maybe one day the family might accept, who knows? However, that's not his place to say. He went further to include that presently, the man's getting older and he knows his time's coming up. Somehow, he can't keep on saying it, since it was only going to make him look foolish. Johnson went further mentioning that there were too many people who were there, who saw all that happened, and at some point, he just felt maybe it was time he should say something. Brian Johnson also cleared the point that he wasn't going to talk about this hit song because the whole controversy that the guy brought up was bothering him. But the truth was, although at some point he got bothered in a way, then he later thought to himself that maybe it was just one of those conspiracy theories by people just seeking attention. Maybe later it will all just fade away. Over the years, it has felt like a mark that just won't go away. So he thought maybe it was the right time to say, that's enough. More controversies were birthed from the news of Scott's involvement, as well as other artists who also gave their thoughts. Let's get into all of the details. Another controversy was birthed concerning rumors that Bon's family receives royalties on Back in Black because it's his lyrics. Johnson also made comments about this, saying that there was no way his family received royalties for it. But if they received royalties, it was because of all the stuff he has done, not particularly because he wrote the lyrics. He went further to mention that most artists will have an estate just like most people do after they pass on, and there's still money coming in from the period of their work. So, the same thing happened in the case of Scott. The royalties the family got were a result of the work he has put in, In another instance, Johnson was asked during an interview why he stopped writing AC/DC's lyrics in the mid-80s. In response, Johnson mentioned that he thinks that was a management decision and not like something in particular happened, and it didn't have anything to do with him. When it was said that the other bandmates were going to be the ones fully writing the lyrics, Johnson commented on this by saying that it would give him a little bit of rest not having to worry about coming up with something now and again, and besides, he never thought of it that much. All he mentioned was that he doesn't care if the guys decide to go ahead and do all of their lyrics. Although, he mentioned that he must admit that somehow he misses some of his lyrics. However, he is fine with it, so it doesn't bother him at all. Johnson wasn't the only one who made comments about the controversy on Scott writing the lyrics. Angus also shut down the rumor that Bon Scott was involved in the songwriting process of several of the Back in Black tracks. Angus mentioned that Bon Scott never really got the chance to write those lyrics. At the time, himself and Malcolm were the ones writing songs. That became the songs for Back in Black. During that period, they were in London in a rehearsal room, and Scott had come down too. What used to happen was that he and Malcolm would get together and get a drum kit, and Malcolm would get behind the drums sometimes, and he would get on the guitar and just tap out a riff. Other times, Malcolm would get on the guitar and he'd get him to just knock out a simple beat on the drums. Anyhow, they were all working and trying things out, and it was on an intro which was actually what became the intro for Hell's Bells. So one fateful day, Scott showed up and Malcolm called out to him and asked if he could get behind the kit, because originally Scott started as a drummer. By the time he got behind the drum kit and they decided to try something out, it eventually became the intro. After that, they got on another one, which was Have a Drink on Me, a riff Malcolm was playing around with. So that was how they were able to work out the intro on that, and that was how things worked in the band most times. Angus went further to state that if anyone was looking out for what Bon Scott had done, it was just to help them with those demos on the drums. He further stated that before Scott's passing, he even said to them that they were always working till nighttime, and that he was leaving and he would hook up with them the following week. Somehow, he had been working on some lyrics at that time saying that they'd hook up next week, and maybe the three of them can just start going through stuff. But unfortunately, Scott passed on before that. When Bon Scott tragically passed away, AC/DC was at the edge of a global commercial breakthrough, especially after they had just wrapped up touring in support of their album. With all of the controversies, quite a few renowned artists shared their thoughts on this debate. The engineer of both Highway to Hell and Back in Black, Tony Platt, recalled that both himself and producer Mutt Lange had already started listening to demos of material for the album that would become Back in Black just before Scott's passing. According to Platt, that particular morning he found out about Scott's passing, it got stuck into his memory. He mentioned that at that time, he was working with Mutt on another album for an English band. He was even staying at one of his friends' places, so Mutt was picking him up in his car on the way to the studio. They had started listening to rehearsal demos of songs from the guys because at that time, for Back in Black, they already had the plans ready and the studio booked. So they knew that the album was about to start and it was the next one they were going to do. In another instance, Whitfield Crane admitted to hearing some unmistakable Bon Scott's lines throughout Back in Black. He went further to mention that all of his rock friends were curious about it, but somehow, no one knows the real answer. He also stated that Scott Ian told him once that he was talking to Eddie Kramer, and in one instance, Eddie Kramer told him that he had heard a bunch of Back in Black songs with Bon on it. He even said that as a person, he was curious to know if what Kramer said was true, because the lyrics sounded so much like Bon Scott, and did have Bon's thumbprint on it. Of course, he admitted to not knowing the true answer to that, but he somehow feels like it's Bon's lyrics. Jesse Hughes was another artist who also seems to share the same opinion as Crane, saying that he considers Back in Black to still be Bon Scott's work. Even though it's got a different singer, he stated that all those songs were tested with Bon Scott and were somehow demoed with Bon Scott. But perhaps the best evidence of Scott's involvement in the writing of the Back in Black material was from AC/DC's drummer, Simon Wright. Wright commented that Angus played him a tape one time when he was at his house in Holland, and there was no vocal on it, but it was Bon playing drums to the riff of Back in Black. He went further to mention that it was a pretty straightforward beat, but it had a good feel to it, and he's sure it would have sounded awesome if Bon sang on the Back in Black album, but somehow, unfortunately, they would never know. Well, with all the back and forth and controversies that came up from AC/DC's hit song Bon Scott and Brian Johnson, in case you were wondering, Scott is not credited as a writer on any of the songs for Back in Black. On both sides of the vinyl, it simply states that all the songs were written by Angus Young, Malcolm Young, and Brian Johnson. So, despite all of the controversies, clues, and claims mentioned earlier, it appears as though the AC/DC hit song discussion will forever remain one of rock's greatest controversies. Or maybe with Brian Johnson's revelations, the truth behind these controversies has finally come to light. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.